Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to speak as slowly as I possibly can to let everyone continue filing in. Looks like we have a good attendance so far, so thank you for joining us. I am Kristen LeBlanc. I'm with the Association for Talent Acquisition Professionals, and we are pleased today to have HiredScore here to present some amazing content and interesting information for us. I'm going to turn it over to HiredScore, but our title of our event today is How Can Talent Acquisition Balance Diversity and Time to Fill? So I know you're all looking forward to hearing more. So Tracy, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to kick us off and introduce our panelists.
Of course. So I'm just sharing my screen. So just give me one moment. All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where we will discuss the very important topic of how talent acquisition teams can balance diversity and time to fill. I'm Tracy Montour. I'm the Director of Product Marketing at HiredScore, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we kick off this exciting discussion, I just want to provide some background on HiredScore and why we're so interested and knowledgeable about this topic. So if you're not familiar, HiredScore has been creating technology that supports the Fortune 500 for almost a decade. We focus on building best-in-class artificial intelligence, automation, and deep integrations that safely and transparently drive critical business outcomes in recruitment productivity, diversity hiring, internal mobility, and total talent management. Our proprietary technology provides compliant by design, customized by client AI that seamlessly connects data and systems to power the shift to proactive and fair HR decisions. We're live in 150 countries and available in 70 languages. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to today's speakers, Tabitha, Asura, and Smees. Tabitha is a compassionate DEI leader with an eye for detail and process improvement. They support HiredScore's clients and prospects to focus on hiring underrepresented candidates more effectively and compliantly. Previously, Tabitha led a DEI committee with over 40 members and 10 working groups, and led and executed a Global Diversity Month with 34 events at large language service provider. Smees is a consulting leader who loves to ask difficult questions. Liam started his career as a recruiter and then spent the next 10 years advising clients on how they can achieve their talent acquisition goals and the business value of doing so. Liam is also located in London, where it's quite warm today. So, we'll be really shining the spotlight on him during this heat wave. So I really appreciate him joining. And I'd love to start the discussion now. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to type them in the chat at any point during the conversation. We will either handle them directly during the questions that the panelists will be answering, or following that in the Q&A. So I'm sure there are differing levels of maturity in the audience in terms of building an effective and efficient diversity and inclusion strategy. And I'd love to hear from you both on what some of the foundations needed to pursue a robust D&I strategy in hiring are. So Tabitha, would you like to kick us off?
Sure. So I think one of the really key foundational elements is making sure that you have consistent data collection at point of apply. Now, what data you can collect at point of apply is going to depend on your location, right? If we're in the US, there's quite a lot that we can ask. If you're in, say, Germany or France, you can't ask about things like race or ethnicity. So really thinking through, what can I ask, and making sure that you're asking it at point of apply. Now, that should always be optional. That should be something candidates can opt into. And so you also want to make sure you're giving candidates clarity on why you're asking so that they volunteer that information. You need that information if you're going to be able to meet targets. And I think for me, one of the things that kind of blew my mind and brought me over to HiredScore was I felt like when I was working with recruiters, a lot of times they didn't have real-time visibility. So having that real-time visibility and that ability to see, am I meeting targets or am I falling short, is really, really critical, I think. And then I always think it's important, Chip and Dan Heath, who wrote Switch, which is how to change things when change is hard, talk about the fact that we really need to have, in order to make change, a clear direction, motivation, and it needs to be easy to achieve. So we need to make sure recruiters are supported on what expectations we have, what those targets look like, and what are appropriate actions to reach those targets. So those are, I think, kind of the key three things that I'd start with if I were trying to say, okay, I really want a robust D&I strategy in hiring. I'm going to collect that data. I'm going to understand in real time who's applying, who's making it through my funnel. And then I'm also going to make sure that recruiters know if that's not happening, what steps do I take?
Yeah, I think what I'd add to that is I love the way that Tabitha said around that real-time data, right? And it's about how we can be proactive in our step-by-step plan. Too many organizations look at DE&I metrics like retrospectively when it's too late. So this was our balance of hires last year, for instance. That's a very kind of reactive way of looking at it. So you need to be aware of the actions that you're taking at the top of the funnel, but also throughout every step of the process, whether it might be exclusive, whether you're reducing your opportunity to make fair and unbiased decisions. Having that real-time data and setting targets or KPIs to hit as you move through those different stages means there'll be less surprises and then all this like rush and haste at the end of your process to try and fix and balance those shortlists and shortcomings that you might have. But what it also gives is the recruitment teams this kind of agility. You're not waiting to the end of the process, realize you're not hitting the KPIs when it's already too late, and then working really hard to kind of do some diversity sourcing, for instance, right at the end of the process, which might just be adding time to fill to your process, for instance, because you thought you were going to get to a hire based on what you had, and then the not hitting the diversity targets, didn't know you weren't going to hit the diversity targets until the end, and then having to deal with that impacting your other KPIs.
Yeah, really interesting points. And Tabitha, you mentioned consistent data collection at the point of apply is critical. Can you talk about how companies can proceed if perhaps they don't have historical data or if they don't have access to this data?
Sure. So I think the key thing is to start asking now, right? I think that's something I've seen across a lot of organizations, especially when we're outside of the US. You have to start somewhere. There's a lot of places where that hasn't necessarily been the norm. And so it's really about getting that initial request out. There's some really solid resources I was seeing yesterday through Aperion Global that talked about specifically what you can ask in each country. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. Checking with your compliance team as well, making sure that they don't have any concerns, but really getting that added as soon as you can so that you have that data to start building off of.
Thank you. So we spoke a little bit about the importance of data and what the most common, some of the common challenges that you mentioned globally that teams have. So I'd love to touch, on this next topic of what are the most common areas where TA teams lack visibility and control of their D&I data and processes. Tabitha, would you want to take that?
Yeah, so I think Liam hit the nail on the head, right? There's always this look back happening. We're always looking at, if we have the data, we're looking at data that is sometime in the past. And I don't know about you all, but I haven't had a normal year in a really long time, right? Every year is an abnormal year. We've got a pandemic, we've got a great resignation, we've got something going on where it's really hard to compare apples to apples. How did I do last year? So I think that's a major area of concern. I think there's also challenges with communicating across teams in terms of D&I data. I know a lot of times you've got different recruitment teams, you've maybe got different sourcing teams, D&I leaders, HR, everyone has a different piece of the puzzle. And so that can be, I think, a major challenge as well. And then I think there's challenges with showing candidate level information, right? Some folks do have access to know, Tabitha identified themselves as non-binary, white, all these different things, right? Well, if we're looking at that and we're saying we don't actually want to take that into consideration, but maybe we are, the trouble is it creates these assumptions. It creates the assumption that I'm hired based on my identity rather than on my ability. And I think that's really frustrating for candidates because they get treated differently. And it actually creates a different issue. So I think if you're going to have the data, having it in some way where it's at an aggregate level. So you're really thinking about kind of along the way. And then I think we also do have some challenges with goals alignment, right? How are you rewarding your recruiters who are really doing a nice job of progressing diversity through their slates? Are you, supporting those goals, or is it something that's going to end up at the bottom of the list every day because the support's just not there for them?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Getting the data in the first place is always a challenge. And as Tabitha mentioned earlier around the different laws and whether it being voluntary, et cetera, can be difficult. But I think what's interesting to me is like the next piece is understanding that the choices that a recruiter might make, or there are choices that a hiring manager might make that could be super limiting on when they're posting a role. So the requirements you've asked for may be limiting to certain groups, or just your general volumes of people for that matter. So having the insight to know that, okay, if you're asking for 4 years experience rather than 3 years experience in a certain area, how that can be uninclusive to certain groups where that isn't a typical field where they would have had experience in. So being able to understand that and the impact that could have on the diversity of their talent pool, so they can kind of get ahead of that really early in the process.
Thank you. And just a reminder, I know there were a few people that joined in the last few minutes. If you have any questions, don't be shy, type them in the chat, and we will be happy to answer them for you. Great. So I know it can be challenging to translate company goals into daily activities that drive impact in general, but this challenge becomes more elevated when it's something as critical as diversity and inclusion. So based on your experiences, Tabitha and Liam, with our clients at HiredScore and other conversations we've been having, how can recruiters translate company-wide diversity goals into daily activities that drive impact?
Sure. So I was in a session last week, and Mina Bopaya, who's from Brevity and Wit, said something that really stood out to me, and that's focus on observable behaviors. Hold everyone to those expected behaviors and operationalize the change we want to see. It's great to strategize, but if we don't take measures that are really clear, observable behaviors, it's really hard to make that change. So some of these I think can include sourcing from more than one platform. So consider if you're hosting to specialized platforms versus just to LinkedIn. Consider also how you're building pipelines. If we're going to events, how are we saving those folks? And how are we resurfacing them to make sure that we're actually reaching out to them? Set some slate diversity goals at different stages in the funnel, and clarity on when those might not make sense, right? I think we saw maybe about a month or two back, there were some organizations that had set slate diversity goals, but then they weren't following through on them. And so if we're not going to, we need to know the reasons why we're not going to. Maybe that's because we're prioritizing internal candidates, or maybe we're prioritizing referrals, or maybe we really have a threshold where we need this job filled by this date, and it's whoever's best within that time frame. So you want to make sure that you're setting those clearly. Recruiters, escalate when you feel concerned about any sort of imbalance that you're seeing in the process. Talk this through with everyone that you're working with. That's how we're going to make real change. Make sure when you're working directly with candidates, you're communicating fairly and evenly. If you're giving feedback, make sure it's actionable. If you're responding, try to balance timing so everyone's getting a fair opportunity. Close out those recs so no one's wasting time applying into a role that isn't even open. I think all of those come from kind of ensuring you're taking those inclusion and allyship learnings and treating people in a way that helps them feel like they belong. And then Leah mentioned this a little bit, but when we're thinking about are the requirements appropriate, have intake sessions with your hiring manager if you have a new job description. We took a look at over 500 million hiring decisions that had come through our tool. And what we found is 45% of recs could be more inclusive if qualifications had been expressed differently. So really make sure that those qualifications are well optimized and well thought through. And then finally, I'd kind of go back to that mitigating bias. We all have those little biases. Anything we can do to kind of help remove some of those. I think a huge one is masking your screening of resumes. Resumes are all these different formats. We're taking those things into account. We're taking into account how close does someone maybe live? What's their name? All of these things that don't actually answer, can this person do the job? Do they meet those job requirements? We want to stick really closely to the job requirements, both for compliance reasons, but also because that's what's fair to candidates, right? That's what we've said we expect from them. And we shouldn't be adding hidden requirements. And so masking is a really great way to kind of mitigate the fact that, I don't know about the rest of you, but when I was a hiring manager, I was like skimming through as fast as I could. And when we're skimming, it's when it's really hard to sit and take a step back and think that through.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I love that bit about the kind of hiring manager, and when we were talking about when you're posting a role, I think have the conversation with the hiring manager, be that business partner to them, because like the likelihood is that job requisition might be like 10 years old, right? It might be 5 years old, it might be 3 years old. The likelihood it needs some updating, right? So don't just take it as gospel. There's an opportunity for us to update and educate hiring managers on what are the important things they should be looking for. I love that piece you said around removing the bias. I think doing that in a way that still creates a great experience for the hiring manager is important. We don't want CVs with big like redacted pieces of information from them. We want it in a simple way that hiring managers can still have a good experience in, even though we've removed the things that could potentially creep bias into our decisions. So I really think that is the kind of the last piece in the puzzle in my mind in terms of truly ensuring that we have fair hiring decisions made. I mean, it's clear that diversity and inclusion is a focus for most companies. Every company I speak to, it crops up in conversation. I mean, Tabitha's our D&I expert. I assume every conversation you have, it creeps up. But also, everybody's wanting to change for the better, right? So by removing these subtle things, the things that are unconscious, the things that we don't want to creep in, the things that have been made an unfair playing field, removing those things that we don't want to creep in is a great, and the masking of CVs is a great way to do it. I think what I'd also encourage people to do is be creative in the way they look for talent. And that's why, Tabitha, I loved it when you said, look in different places, right? Like, don't try and fix things by doubling down on what you're already doing. It can be so frustrating for me if I'm talking to an organization that's like, oh, we need to increase our diversity and inclusion hiring. We're going to spend a lot of money on a new career website. I have a cheesy analogy, which is this is like painting your front door a different color and expecting somebody different to walk down the street. I think we have to be creative in the way that and what we're doing, going out to places that we wouldn't usually look for talent, instead of just sitting and waiting for them to come with a new fancy new painted door.
Love that analogy, Liam. We do have some questions coming in, which is great to see. And one of these questions relates to what we were just talking about. And at HiredScore, we really believe that there's no silver bullet that solves diversity and inclusion challenges. So one of the attendees asked, which tools do you recommend to evaluate the talent market that you feel are the best at advancing D&I goals? So Tabitha, I don't know if you want to talk through some of the technology that we're aware of, and I'm sure there's more out there as well.
Sure. So, I mean, there's tons and tons of technology. I could probably just ramble on through a whole webinar. But I think kind of looking at some components that are external sourcing, so organizations like JobWell, looking at some that are focused on kind of that recruitment marketing and really the attraction piece. So off the top of my head, Gem, Phenom come to mind. For us, I think making sure that when you're attracting those people and those job qualifications are aligned, that you have the insights you need, that you're able to mask those resumes. Those are all things that HiredScore provides. Standard analytics. So that's something your team probably already has. If not, hit me up on the side, we can chat. And then I think training is really, really key, right? I've been really impressed with Aperion Global, who I mentioned earlier. Been impressed with Vantage Point, which is like VR experiences, Translator, which is leadership and development training that has some really great insights. I also think if we're talking about the E in DEI, thinking about compensation equity is really, really critical. Syndio comes to mind off the top of my head as an organization that's got really great technology to support you there.
Great. And we actually have a few more questions relating to this. This seems a pretty common question. One attendee did ask for that resource that you mentioned, Tabitha, from Appearing Global. We can share that in the follow-up email to everybody, because that is a great resource. And then this is another great question that we received, which is, what are some ways to fairly incentivize recruiters for diversity hiring goals?
That is a great one. So I would say, look at how you're incentivizing other goals for recruiters, right? Diversity isn't necessarily something that we should be treating as entirely separate from everything else. But if you're, say, doing spot bonuses based on certain things, consider adding one there. If you have, and I would also recommend looking at, equity and fairness within your own team and thinking about who has which kinds of roles and what are reasonable metrics for them to hit, right? There are some roles that are going to be much more challenging to progress a diverse slate for than others. And so you don't want to punish a recruiter who doesn't have that same opportunity. So do take a look at that. But I think it is sort of a matter of looking at, how am I incentivizing other goals? Make sure that I'm not saying, actually, I think that this is the most important metric that I'm measuring my recruiters against. You want to balance those things out.
Definitely.
The only thing I'd add to that as well is that to remember that the DE&I isn't just a problem or a focus for TA or HR. Like this is a wider full company focus, what it definitely should be, right? So we should be incentivizing not only the recruiters on the actions that they take in order to ensure that we're getting good diverse candidates going through our funnel. We should be rewarding organizations that make it an inclusive organization for those people to come in and stay within the organization too.
Love that. Let's move on to the next question. I think this is our last question, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A. So I just wanted to discuss, if recruiters can do one thing today to make an impact on diversity hiring, what would it be and why?
All right, so no one's going to love this answer, but there isn't one thing. There's not a silver bullet. Every organization has different needs. Every location has different needs. But I would say that having a supportive technology that allows you to focus on creating a consistent and inclusive experience for your candidates and being mindful of their different needs. So for instance, I think a great thing to think through is some candidates are going to find it really, really helpful to have the camera on. They may need to see your mouth. They may lip read. Other candidates are going to find it really, really challenging to have their camera on. They're going to get overwhelmed. They're going to need you to, so you can adjust what you're doing, but make sure that you're offering a consistent experience to everyone. And I think having supportive technologies in place really allows you to take that time to get nuanced, to take that care. So that would be my one thing.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it would be making use of the great diverse talent that you already have at your fingertips. So whether that be sort of like resurfacing silver medalists. So I always say that like you've already paid for these candidates, whether that be through your marketing budget, whether it be through your sourcing time, recruiter time, looking to pull these people in and interest them in your organization. What we don't want to do is just let those candidates go sit stale in an ATS somewhere. We want to be able to resurface those people, re-engage those people because you've already paid for them. Like there could be a great hire. They might not have been right for that previous requisition that they originally applied to or came into your process for. I think also looking to push internal mobility. This is going to be so big. It is so big. It's going to continue to be so big moving forward. So it's really important about the inclusion part. It's really important about engaging employees, making them feel like they're valued, they're wanted, their opportunities for progression. If there's a role within the organization that's a good fit for that person, going to them, talking to them about it, because we've all been in that situation where we've worked for organizations and we've potentially been unhappy in our role and potentially wanted to move into something else, or been stale in our role and looking to move into something else. It's very difficult as an individual, especially as an individual that doesn't work in the recruitment process, to know where to go and how to navigate that, what skills they have, what are transferable, where the sideways steps might be. So by making this a responsibility of the recruitment team, we can kind of treat those internals like externals, right? Where we're able to approach them for roles that they're a good fit for, and have conversations around them, and make sure that you're keeping that super talented internal talent that you've worked so hard to bring in the first place. Because if we're not, you know, external companies are going to be knocking on their door and looking to take them.
Absolutely. And I was just looking at the data, Liam, and right now there's 2 jobs for every unemployed person right now. So definitely a time for us to retain our talent. So those were all the questions we had prepared. I'm going to hand it over to Tabitha to talk through some of the learnings from working with the largest and most innovative companies in the world who are making measurable and meaningful progress towards their D&I goals with HiredScore. And after that, we will make sure we answer every single one of the questions that we have time for. So Tabitha, over to you.
Great. So I do want to, of course, talk a little bit about what we do at HiredScore. And that's really, we've made proactive solutions that are unlocking some of those complex diversity hiring challenges. So we've chosen to really focus on top of the funnel, making sure that we're getting the right candidates in through the front door, ready to go. Monitoring those diverse slates, being able to understand how is talent progressing, and then mitigating that hiring bias. So I'm proud to say we were awarded Fast Company's 2022 World Changing Ideas for AI. Blueprint is our tool that's focused on really getting those real-time rec qualifications adjusted so that you're not only attracting the right talent, but when you're attracting them, they meet the qualifications that you've set, and you've set those qualifications appropriately. We have D&I Fetch, which is really focused on the sourcing component. It's going back through and looking at folks that you have already attracted, that you've already brought in, and really helping route that diverse talent for nurturing so that you're able to get those folks into your organization. Diversity Insights, which is a compliant way of taking a look at your overall slate diversity and making sure that you're able to track your goals for TA and hiring managers and that you're on track for those. And then finally, our mask screening. So that's really our intelligent and data-based masking capabilities. I mentioned masking earlier. One of the challenges, if we're just like blanking out, say someone's school or previous place of work, is it gets really hard to understand what's happening. We actually replace those with smart insights. So if let's say I used to work at Disney. Now we don't want that in there because maybe you really dislike Disney. So what we're actually replacing it with is something that'll say entertainment company. And you're still going to see years of experience. You're still going to see all of those bullets from their resume, but it's going to help you make decisions based on their ability to do the job, as opposed to on arbitrary things that actually aren't necessarily relevant.
And Tabitha, not to interrupt you, but we did just get a question asking that if HiredScore integrates with Workday, and yes, we do have a deep integration with Workday. So, definitely a lot of expertise there on integrating in that space.
Yeah, and just on that point, I think when we were talking about different technologies earlier and the importance of data, it's also important not to have those data silos as well. So when you're thinking about the technology that you're looking to buy and bring into your tech stack, make sure that there's integrations between the two, because what we want is that clear journey of data. We've been talking about getting in front of it. We've been talking about measuring it step by step. If you've created silos in your process, that can be really hard to do. And you end up just doing things retrospectively and adding things up, and it all gets messy as well.
Yes, I think that was definitely one of the challenges I tried to highlight with, different teams not being able to communicate. And part of that had to do with that siloing of different bits of data. So great call out.
Yeah, we actually just got another question around iCIMS. So yes, we do have an iCIMS integration as well. We really integrate with all the major players in the industry. That's definitely part of who we are. We like partnering with other organizations. So if you have a question about an integration, you can follow up with us after the webinar, find us on LinkedIn. We're more than happy to answer those questions for you. So I'd love to just hit up our last slide, and then I promise we are absolutely done with the slides, but Tabitha, back over to you.
Sure. So I think sometimes it's also helpful to understand what kind of outcomes are people having, right? So what we found with our D&I solutions and with the areas that we've focused on, these are from a Fortune 50 client. So, and what we found is that at the top of the funnel, we're seeing a 71% average increase in diverse candidate volume for that client. For slate diversity, we've seen a 28% increase in diverse candidate representation from the top of the funnel to the bottom of the funnel. So watching that progression happen. And then we're also seeing hiring bias being mitigated, means that we've got a 29% increase in gender representation and a 40% increase in ethnic representation. So these are real numbers. These are coming from an existing set of clients. And I think it's important to highlight that there are solutions to these problems. There are systemic solutions. It doesn't always have to be the theory. I think the theory is really important. I think education is super critical because we want to make sure that once we're getting these folks into our organizations, they feel safe, they feel a sense of belonging, they're able to get up and go and do all of that work that you're setting them up to do. But I do also want to highlight that there are clear ways that we can start making an impact.
Liam, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well on this slide.
Yeah, I think what's being a value guy, this is the stuff that really gets me excited around the effort that you put in and what the value that you get from the effort that you put in. But using that word effort, I think is important to identify that, like, we're using technology to help us give insights, to help us give a lot of this sort of heavy lifting through this process. And what I would do is like compare it to if you had to do all of these actions in order to drive these results manually, the amount of time it would take to, some teams will have dedicated diversity sourcing specialists that go out to certain areas, to different platforms, et cetera, to try and source diverse talent to prop up their pipelines. That can be super labor intensive, and we're having to spend lots of money in doing so. Also, in terms of your overall KPIs, if we're having to pause our recruitment process to try and bring balance into our shortlists, what's that doing to your time to interview, your time to fill, right? These are all important metrics to the business. So what we're looking to do is help organizations get better with these numbers, but without just throwing loads of resources and effort at it.
And we are getting a lot of great questions, so I just want to tackle some of these. So Tabitha, perhaps you can take this one. Someone's wondering how we're defining diversity in this instance, and I'd love for you to kind of talk through our approach to customized by client solutions. Oh, you're on mute.
You'd think I'd have figured this out by now, but we're still working on it. So we actually customize what diversity means for each client, and frequently also for each location that they go live in. The reason for that is diversity is going to look really, really different depending on your organization, right? If you are in an organization where you're attracting and you have applicants that are almost entirely from one group, that's going to be quite different than if you have applicants from a lot of different groups. Race and ethnicity, for instance, don't operate the same way outside of the US as they do inside of the US. So we take a really tailored approach so that we're making sure that we're kind of dealing with the complexities of what does diversity mean for you, right? Diversity is talking about people in relation to other people. It's not, there's no such thing in my mind as a diverse candidate, because that's an individual. One individual is inherently diverse. We're all diverse. So it's really in relation to each other is where we would be measuring diversity.
Absolutely.
Hope that was the question.
Yes, definitely. And another question here is, how does hired score exactly increase diversity in the top of the funnel? Is it just by using more inclusive language in the job postings? And I think this actually relates to another question that we asked, or that someone asked, which is, how is hired score different than other diversity and inclusion solutions out there? So maybe we can tackle those both at once.
Sure. So I think one of the major differences, and part of kind of how we've approached top of the funnel, my brain is a little slow there, is that we have really looked at how do you recirculate candidates who have already applied. who have already expressed interest in your organization. I think a lot of other tools out there are really focused on how do I attract new candidates? And that's great. I think that there's something important about that. I think those things interact really, really well, right? The more candidates that you have in your system, the more that we can resurface. But our approach has really been to focus on that aspect and to focus on how do we change the actual requirements? It's all well and good if we're attracting candidates, but if they don't meet the requirements, they're going to have a really hard time ever getting hired. So we want to make sure that we're setting requirements correctly from the very beginning. So Blueprint, which was one of the tools I referenced earlier, is really focused on taking a look and seeing, am I setting those requirements where I should be? Because that's what's going to mean that if I attract the candidates, they're actually able to progress through the funnel, and we're not creating a situation where I've got a really nice looking top of the funnel, but then we're not getting anywhere.
Absolutely. Liam, do you have anything to chime in with?
I mean, I would just echo the getting the most out of the diverse candidates that you've already attracted in at the top of the funnel. So what you can do is look to recirculate those candidates back into the top of the funnel when they're a great fit for another role. So if you have done some great marketing campaigns that have brought you a really good, rich, diverse talent, getting those people resurfacing if they were a silver medalist is really important. But I think also, especially for teams that have dedicated diversity sourcing teams, if you're putting loads of effort into like primarily like sourcing diverse candidates and they're not a great fit, why not have a really efficient way to resurface that candidate if they're a great fit for another role?
Absolutely. And going back to, that concept of, keeping that top of the funnel fresh, getting more candidates in there that can be recirculated. Someone had a question around, how do you recommend companies source more diverse candidates if they don't have enough diverse talent in their existing talent community?
Sure. So I think there's a lot of different strategies for this that I've seen. Some can be attending events, right? Whether those are in person or virtual, really trying to network with specific groups. So off the top of my head, I'm thinking like lesbians in tech might be a good one. It's really going to depend on your industry, right? But there's so many different organizations that you can partner directly with. There are also organizations that are focused on specifically getting your job descriptions in front of candidates. Liam, I'll let you maybe speak a bit more to that since you have actual experience as a recruiter. I've just worked with a ton of wonderful recruiters.
Yeah, I think the events piece is a real vital tool. I've seen organizations do it really successfully with like female coding hackathons, for instance, and creating events specifically designed to not only bring those communities together to network and actually develop the whole female coder community, but also to give recruiters access to talent that might be a good fit for their organization as well. Just talking about those things sort of openly. I think I mentioned slightly earlier around being more creative in the places that you look for talent. So if you post on your careers website, you post on Indeed.com and you post on LinkedIn and then wait for people to apply, and it's not been driving you diversity in your talent pools, start thinking about different mediums for finding talent. So whether it be looking at different job boards, whether it be looking at different professional networks, whether it be looking at communities online, whether it be looking at things like GitHub, whether it be looking at, depending on the type of role that you're looking to pull in, I would just encourage them to try different methods, because if what you're doing is not working, doubling down and throwing more resource at it isn't necessarily always going to drive the results.
Absolutely. On that note, someone asked a question around if there are specific diversity sites for Canada, but you both may know about the global approach, and I think we have somewhat of a global audience here. So if there are any at a very high level, of course, like resources for different regions of the world in terms of hiring or diversity, if you want to talk through that, Tabitha.
Sure. So there are, for Canada specifically, I believe there's BIPOCjobs.ca. There's a lot of different organizations out there. a really like simple thing, the keywords that I would probably use if I were just trying to search for what these types of organizations are like, is I would probably search something along the lines of hiring for whatever the specific group that you're trying to target is and your location, right? Like I mentioned before, we've got different groups of people who are going to be diverse in relation to your organization. So if I was, for instance, in, let's say Japan, I might be looking for folks who had immigrated from another country. So maybe that would be what I'd search. Or if I worked in a company that was heavily female, I might be looking for organizations that support men in certain types of roles. So it's really about thinking about, okay, which are the groups that I want to target, and then searching that with your location and hiring. You're usually going to find there's lots of great nonprofits out there as well.
Great. One question we have here, it's a little bit of a different question. It's around if you have any insights to share around hiring people with disabilities.
Sure. So I think this is something that's like very near and dear to my heart, super important to me. I think making it very clear at the outset how to ask for any sort of accommodations. So you want to make sure that when people are applying in, they're able to apply in. Make sure that your website's accessible. Make sure that people who are using a screen reader are able to take a look at it. There's all sorts of wonderful organizations out there that work on that type of thing. And really communicate with your candidates, every candidate, not just candidates who you suspect might be disabled, and ask them, are there any accommodations I could make that would make this easier for you? It may be that they want to have camera on, it may be camera off, it may be they want closed captioning. There's a million different things that it could be, but I think really practicing the inclusion piece is a critical first step. There are also wonderful organizations out there that are focused on getting disabled folks into the workforce. It's such a long, wonderful list that I'm, of course, now trying to think of one off the top of my head, and I'm coming up with 20s. That's not helpful. I'll think on it and I'll give you at least one, but there are a lot of different organizations that'll help you partner. There are also organizations, if you're maybe a little bit concerned about, can I actually support someone with a disability in my organization, who will help you look at that and help you figure out what kinds of disabilities that your organization is supportive of.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is just the way that we've talked about all diversity in hiring, right? In that giving everybody the fair chance to be considered equal in terms of the way that their application is looked at. So making sure that the job role that you're posting, you're using language that's necessary for the role and not going to rule people out because they've had a different experience in life and therefore might not have had the same experiences that the job description is originally written for, that actually turns out it's not critical towards the success of the person in the role. And then I think as well, removing things like we talked about mass screening, removing things that might be an unconscious bias that creeps in when looking through, that this CV looks or resume looks very different to the previous CV that I looked at. There might be a strong reason behind that. So if we can mask those resumes, if we can put them into similar formats that are easier to interpret for our recruiting and hiring manager teams, then there's less opportunity for bias to creep in that might be a disadvantage to any candidate, but also a disabled candidate.
Great. And we just have one last question, which I think really hits home at the purpose of this webinar today, which is being able to balance that diversity and efficiency elements. I know compliance is a big factor in diversity hiring. So how can talent acquisition teams balance compliance, time to fill, and diversity hiring all at the same time and do that in an efficient way?
Sure. So really set those job requirements clearly and hold to them. Want to make sure that there aren't any hidden requirements. There should never be a requirement surrounding something like age. You should never be saying, oh, I want someone who's hungry and young. That's not actually going to ever be a good thing. you don't want to think about things like resume gaps or specific universities or colleges. Those have a tendency to really impact diversity in a way that's going to be not beneficial to your organization. So really hold to clear job requirements that are actually in the job description. From there, aggregate your insights at the rec level so that you're able to lead to actions like more sourcing or consideration of unwritten requirements that are reasonable, such as perhaps if it's an in-person role, you actually have to have someone within a distance that they can commute to it. And then the other thing that I've found really, really useful is having an interview rubric that takes what you've outlined in the job description and then looks at the experience of the candidate relevant to that when you're doing your interview. And so that way you're really comparing people in the sense of, can this person do this job? Are they going to add something to our department versus are they the right fit?
Yeah, I think what I'd add to that is we've talked about some of them today, and obviously we've given some examples of how Hired Score can help. I think that there's a big opportunity to use technology here. I think it can drive lots of efficiencies throughout all recruitment processes, but with D&I, we've been targeted in on how we can help organizations be more inclusive, but without throwing a ton more effort at it. And if you think about technology and AI, it shouldn't have the same biases that we unfortunately have as humans. I think we've all heard the horror story about the large e-commerce company that had a sexist piece of AI, but I think it's about learning about the AI, having it compliant, having it explainable to make sure that it doesn't waver and it doesn't start to creep in unconscious bias. And then what it gives you is the opportunity to make those fairer decisions without throwing loads of resource effort at it. We can make us efficient in the work that we do. It can mean that we can focus on other activities instead of sort of more manual tasks. We're increasing that diversity without massively increasing the effort. So we don't have to make sacrifices on potential other KPIs. This has always been a traditional thing around, okay, now my other KPIs are going to be impacted by the work that I'm having to do, going the extra mile in order to do these different activities. And that's why the whole thing about rewarding recruiters have to be a thing, because we're giving them an extra task to do in their day. What we're saying is like, you should be using the resources around you to allow you to be able to do those things without it having to be all that extra effort and that change management piece as well. It does mean that we can still hit our KPIs. It does mean that all of our stakeholders can be happy with the recruitment process rather than just the one that's focusing on DE&I and that time. And DE&I is a responsibility for the whole business, as I was saying earlier. It's diversity, it's equity, it's inclusion. It's not just, can I get balanced shortlist? It's also around what happens to that person once they've been given the offer, once they join the organization. So we create an inclusive environment for everyone.
And I know I said that was our last question, but we did just get an interesting one, and I think we have time for it. So when is the appropriate timeline, or what is an appropriate timeline to present a diverse slate when hiring for a role?
Sure. So it's going to depend a lot on your organization and who applies in and how quickly, right? Some organizations have a really tight time to fill. They get, 100,000 applicants in a day. Some organizations, you're really fighting to get every single individual applicant. And maybe it takes you a week to get to 5 applicants. So it's going to really depend on the field you're in, the organization that you're in. What I would say is probably, a good thing to take a look at is to take a look at your existing time to fill and to take a look at your existing tools and maybe where they're impacting, either helping or hurting the diversity of folks who are passing through. And I would maybe start there to kind of figure out what an appropriate timeline for you would be. Liam, any thoughts there?
The only thing I'd add is, as we've been saying, by having that real-time data, by having a proactive strategy that's step-by-step throughout every status, you're giving yourself the best chance of success when you get to let's call it the bottom of the funnel in terms of where we've talked at the top of the funnel. If we're looking at it all the way through, you're giving yourself the best chance. So that's what Tabitha and I have been talking about around that real-time data, not having data silos, having all of that at your fingertips, being able to look at it consistently and be able to make proactive changes in order to ensure that when you get to the bottom of the funnel, it doesn't become a bottleneck. It doesn't become a roadblock towards making the best hire for the company because you haven't thought about it earlier in the process around what your diversity goals are.
Absolutely. Well, that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much, Tabitha and Liam. I just want to let everyone know before you sign off, Tabitha has offered to meet with as many of you as possible to discuss not just HiredScore, of course, but your unique questions, unique to your company, your situation, your goals, and just further the conversation. So promise it's not a demo in disguise. We really want to learn from you and talk. And of course, we will provide a demo if that's something that you want. But you can scan this QR code or go to hiredscore.com. You can find us on LinkedIn, and we'll be sending a follow-up email to all the ATAP members with a recording of this webinar. So I just want to thank, of course, Liam and Tabitha for their expertise. And then thank you to everyone who joined and everyone who will be watching later on. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tracy. Thanks everyone for your great questions, and thank you, ATAP and Tabitha. Always a pleasure to present with you. Thank you.
Always. Thank you all so much. Really great to get to be here. Wonderful questions. Thank you.